A few weeks ago, a tax filing season came to an end. This filing season was a very important milestone as it was the first tax filing season under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act signed by the President before Christmas 2017. Congressional Democrats sought to turn the filing season into an indictment of the tax reform through a campaign of misinformation and a campaign of half-truths. They were obsessed with finding anything, just anything, they could hang their hat on to declare that the tax filing system was a failure. So I'll give you a case in point, maybe several cases. They attempted to use early and incomplete tax reform data to mislead taxpayers into believing that since the average tax refunds went down, that the taxpayers' taxes actually went up. And of course, such a claim is just simple hogwash. The size of the tax refund tells anybody nothing, absolutely nothing, about a taxpayer's overall tax liability. The tax refund, as most people ought to know, tells you by how much a taxpayer overpaid the federal government throughout the year. None other than the Washington Post fact checker called out Democrats' tax refund falsehoods as, in their words, nonsensical and misleading. The Democrat talking points earned the Democrats a whopping 4 Pinocchios from that fact checker. Yet the Democrats wouldn't let facts or reason get in their way, because if it did, it wouldn't be a political win for them. The Democrats continued to mislead and scare the public for several more weeks. And why not? The truth might hurt. Then more complete tax refund data came in, showing that the average tax refunds were actually in line with the previous years. So much to my Democrats' chagrin, their favorite talking point was once and for all exposed for what it is: nonsense. The fact is, this filing season was a resounding success for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act signed before Christmas 2017. The filing season happened to run remarkably smoothly. This became even more clear the further into the filing season we went and a more complete picture emerged. On 4 points, all of the IRS computer systems functioned as planned. Refunds were processed in a timely manner. The total number of refunds sent to taxpayers are up, and the average refund amount differed by only $55 compared to the previous tax year. And lastly, and most importantly, millions of middle-income taxpayers saw less of their hard-earned money go to Washington, and of course that was the purpose of the tax bill in the first place. Now, unfortunately, the Democrats remain yet today as determined as ever to take down tax reform through a campaign of misinformation. For years, they've misled the American people and promoted a narrative full of distortions and misrepresentations about what the law does and doesn't do, even when the bill was little more than a one-page outline. Democrats began their campaign to peg tax reform as a giveaway to the wealthy and the tax hike for the middle class. As we drafted, as the committee discussed new ideas, and as the committee drafted a final bill, it actually evolved. It was never like somebody 6 months before said, this is what we're going to pass, and we're going to pass it just this way. No, it evolved considerably from the initial framework. Yet, the Democrat talking points that started when we first started talking about the bill, those talking points never changed, and still today haven't changed. Analysis after analysis, ranging from the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation to even the very liberal Tax Policy Center, showed tax reform would cut taxes on average for every income group. These analyses showed that to the extent there were tax increases, they were largely concentrated on the wealthy. In other words, a more aggressive tax law. Now that's right. The taxpayers, Democrats claim, were the big winners in the tax reform, are actually the ones most likely to see a tax hike. Moreover, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation's analysis, the largest percentage of tax cuts are concentrated among low and middle income groups. For emphasis, the Joint Committee on Taxation's analysis also shows that tax reform made the tax code more progressive. I've said it twice now, say it a lot of times. I'm trying to get somebody to understand that this is what experts say, not what this senator says. Millionaires now shoulder an even larger share of the total tax burden than under prior law. As you can expect, Democrats are determined not to let these facts get in their political way. Since the beginning, they've argued up was down and that tax cuts were tax increases, and they even suggested the bill's passage was a sign of Armageddon. Unfortunately, their constant drumbeat, coupled with little pushback from mainstream media, has worked to mislead too many taxpayers. However, there are signs some in the media are starting to see that the Democrats' talking points are the nonsense that those talking points really are. A few weeks ago, now you might not believe this, the New York Times, of all papers, published an article highlighting how Democratic talking points and far too many Americans' perceptions of the law don't match reality. So I'd like to ask you to study this chart. It compares the liberal Tax Policy Center's analysis of taxpayers receiving tax cuts under the individual income provisions of the law with a recent survey of taxpayers who think they received a tax cut. Now follow me on this chart. As you can see, there's a large gap between how many taxpayers actually received a tax cut and those who think they did. Based on the Tax Policy Center analysis, nearly 70% of Americans earning between $30,000 and $50,000 saw a tax cut, but only about 36% think they got the tax cut. Similarly, more than 80% of the Americans earning $50,000 and $70,000 received a tax cut, but only half that amount, 40%, think that they got a tax cut. And the gap between perception and reality continue as you go up the income scale. Only about half as many people who did actually get a tax cut think they did. As noted in the New York Times, quote, to a large degree, the gap between perception and reality on the tax cuts appear to flow from a sustained and misleading effort by liberal opponents of the law to brand it as a broad middle-class tax cut, end of quote. Now, read liberal opponents as people in the leadership of the Democrat Party, both in Congress and outside of Congress, to mislead the people. And you can see from these statistics on the chart, they were enormously successful. And they probably knew what the information was. But for some people, when it comes to politics, the truth doesn't matter. So something I don't get a chance to do very often is to applaud the New York Times for finally calling Democrats out for their efforts to mislead the American public. But even in this New York Times article, the paper was selective in its reporting. The paper chose to highlight only the Tax Policy Center's analysis of the individual income tax provisions rather than its analysis of all major tax provisions enacted in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Even the liberal Tax Policy Center recognizes the person who has the legal burden of paying a tax isn't necessarily the one who bears the economic incidence of that tax. For instance, it's widely recognized that a portion of the corporate tax ultimately falls on individuals in the form of reduced wages. So we cut the corporate tax rate, and there ought to be a positive benefit for that for the workers. Thus, when all major provisions of tax reform are considered, the percentage of taxpayers receiving a tax cut is not 70%, as reported, but 80%. Moreover, when you look at taxpayers with incomes between $50,000 and $70,000, the percentage receiving a tax cut climbs to 90%. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the complete Tax Policy Center analysis of Americans receiving a tax cut under tax reform.
Without objection.
I hope that the New York Times article is a wake-up call to congressional Democrats and people outside of the Congress to abandon this misleading rhetoric. Unfortunately, it's more likely they will continue their campaign of misinformation. But as more and more hard data comes in on the benefits of tax reform, it will become harder and harder for the American public to take the Democrats seriously with their rhetoric. With tax filing season now behind us, we're finally starting to get some of this hard data. H&R Block has released data for this filing season based upon their experience helping taxpayers during this filing season, which demonstrates how taxpayers fared in each state. As you can see from this chart, again, taxpayers in red and blue states alike all benefited from tax reform. Because you know what the rhetoric was around here even before we voted on this bill. It's an attack on the blue states. Well, it didn't turn out that way. On average, for all states, taxpayers saw a 25% reduction in their tax bill. This data directly contradicts misleading arguments by these Washington Democrats, as I stated, that tax reform was a tax on high-tax blue states due to the cap on state and local deductions, which we set that cap at $10,000. Some of the largest tax reductions are actually found in the high-tax blue states, according to H&R Block, not according to this senator. On average, taxpayers in New Jersey saw the largest reduction in their tax bill at 29%. New Jersey, based on the last several elections, is a blue state. Massachusetts was second largest reduction, 27.6%. And California was the third largest at 27.1%. Blue states. The fact is, on average, taxpayers in every state benefited from tax reform. And in some cases, high-tax blue states fared even better than red states. I am proud of the work that we did on tax reform. No bill is perfect, and we still have to work to address a number of technical correction issues. But we kept our promise to enact meaningful reform that cut taxes for the middle class. Even more important is what tax reform means for long-term economic growth. It doesn't take a tax expert to see income, wages, jobs, unemployment numbers have all very much improved since the enactment of this tax bill. And that reflects significant benefits then obtained by American workers. And of course, that's on top of the direct tax relief that hardworking individuals and families are already receiving, which I described at the beginning of my remarks. Annualized growth in real after-tax personal income averaged 2.5% during the Obama administration. It has averaged 3.3% since tax reform. Annualized growth in real average hourly earnings averaged a mere 0.6% under Obama, compared to 1.7% following the enactment of the tax bill, so about 3 times as much. Monthly job gains averaged 110,000 under President Obama. They've averaged 215,000 after this tax bill was passed. There have been nearly 5.4 million jobs created since January 2017, with more than half of that job creation having occurred since the enactment of tax reform. Under President Obama, the unemployment rate averaged a whopping 7.4%. Today, it has averaged 3.9%. Following tax reform, and for the first time since 2001, the number of job openings in the national economy exceeded the number of unemployed Americans, a phenomenon that has continued for the past year. That means an American who wants a job can get a job. To say it simply, tax reform is working for America. For Democrats to suggest otherwise isn't nothing more than their continued effort to mislead the American public. So, I invite the Democrats to take a page from the New York Times article, acknowledge the facts, and work with us to continue improving economic environment for hardworking individuals and families all across this great country. I yield the floor.